What if the greatest war in American history began without a single warning shot, and the only man who could stop it stepped into a light no human had ever seen? This is the untold story of a nation on the brink, a commander who walked into the unknown, and the moment the entire world held its breath. Stay with me till the end, because what happened inside that glowing fracture changed everything. The first warning arrived on a quiet morning that felt too calm for the month of November. Thin frost covered the sidewalks of Washington, and the air carried a stillness that unsettled Daniel Hale long before he understood why. He tightened the scarf around his neck as he stepped out of the Pentagon South entrance. The sky was a washed-out gray, the kind that seemed to hide something behind its stillness. Daniel felt an unusual pressure in his chest, as if the air itself waited to break. Inside his coat pocket, his phone vibrated again. The screen showed a classified alert marked with the highest warning color. His pulse quickened as he opened it, and an uneasy tremor spread through his hands. Unknown threat detected on multiple surveillance grids. Simultaneous anomalies across borders and seas. No known signature. No verified origin. Possible enemy engagement. He read the lines twice, and each word carved another line of cold dread across his spine. As Deputy Director of Strategic Recon, Daniel had studied every possible model of global conflict, every potential trigger for a world-shaking event, every shadow that enemy nations might cast. Yet none of them matched what he saw now. A woman hurried past him, her heels clicking against the concrete, her eyes wide and unfocused. A siren began to wail from deep within the building, low at first, then rising in a slow, painful climb. Daniel felt the weight of the moment pressing hard against his ribs. He turned toward the command hall, moving quickly through the corridors. People rushed past him with tablets clutched to their chests, their faces pale, their voices strained. The once familiar walls of the Pentagon now looked foreign, lit by emergency strips that pulsed in anxious red. When Daniel reached the main intelligence chamber, a cold silence awaited him. Dozens of analysts sat frozen at their stations, staring at screens filled with static bursts, corrupted maps, and lines of unreadable data. The room felt suspended between heartbeats. General Ross stood at the center table, his jaw clenched, his posture rigid. His eyes lifted when Daniel approached, and there was something raw in that look. Something Daniel had never seen in the general before. Fear. We have no visual confirmation, Roth said as Daniel reached him. His voice was steady, but every muscle in his face betrayed the strain he carried. We are blind across two coasts. Half the satellites are unresponsive, and every model we run collapses before it completes. Daniel leaned closer, studying the shifting data on the central display. It looked like the map of a world losing its breath. What caused it? Daniel asked. He felt the depth of his own voice, heavy, reluctant, afraid of the answer that might come. Roth lowered his gaze for a moment before responding. We have no idea. The word struck Daniel harder than any explosion could have. Not knowing meant they could not predict. Not predicting meant they could not defend. America had entered a war without recognizing the battlefield. A sudden tremor shook the floor beneath them. Lights flickered overhead, and the screens flashed white before covering into a riot of distorted signals. Several analysts gasped and pushed back from their desks, their chairs scraping sharply against the floor. Daniel steadied himself with a hand on the table. The tremor had not felt like an earthquake. It felt deliberate. Roth looked toward him again. That is the third one in 15 minutes, he said. There is a pattern forming. Something is moving. Daniel inhaled deeply. The air tasted metallic, as if charged with something unseen. His thoughts raced in uneven waves. He reached for the closest console and pulled up one of the anomalous feeds. A blurred formation moved across the edge of the Atlantic sensor grid. It shifted like a shadow crossing deeper water, bending signals, distorting frequencies. Daniel narrowed his eyes and tried to isolate it. For a moment it held shape, and a cold shiver ran through his entire body. It did not resemble any aircraft. It did not resemble any missile. It did not resemble anything he had ever studied. Roth watched the same distortion, his expression tightening. Whatever that is, he said quietly, it has already crossed into our airspace. Daniel felt the world closing in around him. The ache in his chest deepened, steady and consuming. Across the command hall, the large digital clock began to count down from a time no one had set. No one spoke. No one moved. Everyone stared at the numbers as they fell. It was as if the entire country had just been given an expiration date. Daniel lifted his head, and for a moment he sensed something beyond fear. A presence. A weight pressing against the edge of awareness. Like a storm standing just outside the door. The tremors grew stronger. The screen shifted again, blurring into a new pattern that silenced the room even further. The anomaly had changed direction. It was heading toward Washington. Daniel set his jaw as a realization formed in his mind, sharp enough to cut through the noise. This was not an attack born from global tensions, borders, or alliances. This was not the enemy they had prepared for. This was something else entirely. Something no one had ever seen. Something no one had believed possible. He felt the pulse in his throat as the alarms grew louder. People scrambled for new orders that did not exist. The air trembled with the echo of what approached. Daniel looked toward General Roth with steadying breath. "Tell me what we have left," he said. The general opened his mouth to answer, but a deafening sound rose from beyond the walls, deep and powerful enough to shake the foundation of the building. Every light died at once, plunging the Pentagon into darkness. The war had arrived, and Daniel Hale had no idea what he was about to face. Darkness swallowed the command hall, so completely that Daniel Hale could not see his own hand. For an instant he felt suspended in an empty void, weightless and uncertain, before the emergency lights activated and washed the room in a deep red glow. People stood frozen in the crimson haze. Some pressed their backs to the walls. Others clutched the edges of their desks as if any wrong movement would shatter the fragile silence. Daniel steadied his breathing and forced his mind to push through the rising fear. General Roth's silhouette emerged from the shadows. His shoulders were squared, but the tension in his voice betrayed the weight he carried. "We have lost the primary grid." That sound you heard came from inside the defensive perimeter. Daniel felt a chill run through the center of his spine. Inside the perimeter meant the unknown force had breached the nation's strongest shield without a single trace of entry. He moved toward the nearest console and attempted to reactivate the feeds. The screen flickered weakly, then dissolved into a field of static that pulsed like a living heartbeat. Every pulse felt synchronized with the tremors rising from the ground. The room vibrated again, this time in a slow, rolling wave that made several people stumble. Loose papers floated from the desks as if the air itself had changed density. Daniel gripped the console, braced his legs, and stared at the static. Something inside the noise shifted. A faint outline formed. Not a machine, not a weapon. A shape that defied every category he had ever known. He leaned in closer, and the haze sharpened into a distorted silhouette that appeared and vanished within the signal's ripples. The shape was moving, and it was moving toward them. Daniel straightened, his jaw tightening. "We need eyes outside," he said. His voice had a steadiness he did not entirely feel. Roth nodded and motioned to a team of reconnaissance officers. They rushed toward the exit, their footsteps echoing through the hall, fading into the corridors beyond. The silence that followed felt unnaturally heavy. Daniel could hear the soft hum of generators struggling to remain alive. He could hear the breathing of the analysts near him, uneven and frightened. He could hear his own pulse, steady but deep. Minutes passed with no updates. Then the sound returned. Not an explosion, not a tremor. A low resonance that filled the building like a vibration traveling through bone. Daniel pressed a hand to his sternum, feeling the sound inside his body rather than around it. He exchanged a look with Roth, and the general's eyes reflected the same unsettling realization. This force was not only physically breaching their systems, it was influencing them in ways no enemy ever had. One of the analysts gasped and pointed toward the main display. The static had shifted again. A new pattern emerged, sharp and deliberate. Lines converged in a single point, then stretched outward in a sweep that looked eerily similar to a map. Daniel leaned closer, analyzing each movement. "It is drawing something," he said quietly. The red emergency lights washed over his face, deepening every shadow beneath his eyes. He could feel a pressure building behind his temples, as if the pattern on the screen pushed directly into his thoughts. Roth watched with clenched fists. What does it mean? Daniel studied the shape carefully. The lines looked like coastlines. Then they connected. Then they looped into something larger, something that resembled the outline of a country. His breath caught. It is drawing our eastern seaboard. The room stiffened with collective tension. Then the shape elongated. It grew inward across the map, reaching toward Washington. A sharp point formed at the end of the path, stopping at the exact location of the Pentagon. A message, a warning, or a declaration. Before Daniel could say anything, the overhead speakers crackled to life. A burst of noise filled the room. Not technological, not mechanical, but something that carried an unnatural resonance. Every person instinctively covered their ears, though it did little to soften the sound. Then, suddenly, as quickly as it came, the noise stopped. The speakers went dead. The emergency lights flickered. Then the reconnaissance team burst back into the hall. Their faces were pale. Their uniforms were covered in dust. Two of them supported a third officer whose legs buckled beneath him. Roth rushed forward. What happened? The officer lifted trembling eyes to the general. We reached the west entrance. There was nothing left of it. Daniel stepped forward, his voice steady. What do you mean by nothing? The officer swallowed, struggling to gather himself. The structure is intact. The walls are intact. But everything inside that corridor has vanished. Equipment, vehicles, guards, everything. A cold silence dropped over the room. Daniel felt a tightening in his chest that grew heavier by the second. Vanish was not a military term. Vanish was a word for things that defied every understanding of conflict. The officer continued, his voice barely audible. The air felt wrong. Thick, heavy, and there were marks on the floor, like something had moved through the concrete itself. Roth's face grew even more rigid. We need to evacuate the building. Daniel shook his head. We cannot abandon the command center. If we leave now, the entire country goes blind. Roth stared at Daniel, torn between instinct and responsibility. The tremor returned, stronger than any before. Ceiling tiles cracked. Dust rained down over the equipment. A section of the back wall buckled outward, as if pushed from the other side. Analysts cried out and scrambled away from the collapsing structure. Daniel braced himself, shielding his head with his arm as debris scattered across the floor. The ground shook again, deeper this time, carrying a force that felt almost intentional. Daniel looked toward the buckled wall, his breath tight in his chest. A fracture formed along the surface, thin at first, then wider, then deeper. Daniel stepped back slowly. Everyone watched in stunned silence. The crack stopped growing. The trembling stopped. The entire room fell into an unnerving stillness that felt more dangerous than the shaking. Daniel waited for the next movement, the next sound, the next sign of whatever force pressed against the Pentagon walls. But nothing came. Not a sound, not a tremor, not a single shift in the air. The quiet grew and grew, stretching beyond comfort, beyond logic, beyond every instinct that told him danger should have followed. Daniel narrowed his eyes at the motionless fracture. His pulse slowed in his chest. Each beat felt heavier than the last. Something was there. He could feel it. He could sense it. But it refused to reveal itself. The officers exchanged confused glances. Roth whispered under his breath, "This makes no sense." Daniel took a slow step forward, drawn by a mixture of dread and determination. The silence remained. The crack stayed frozen. The air stayed perfectly still. It felt as if the entire world held its breath, and the moment dragged on, longer and longer and longer, long enough for Daniel to realize that whatever had reached them had stopped for a reason, but the reason had not revealed itself. Not yet. Daniel remained still as the fractured wall loomed in the dim emergency light. The crack did not widen. It did not pulse. It did not shift. It simply stayed there, carved into the concrete, like a wound that refused to bleed. The absence of movement drew every pair of eyes toward it. Even the faint hum of the backup generators seemed to soften, as if the building itself feared disturbing whatever waited beyond the break. General Roth moved to Daniel's side with slow, Deliberate steps. His voice dropped to a low register, steady but strained. It feels intentional. Daniel nodded. Every instinct within him told the same story. The silence did not represent safety. It represented calculation. He studied the edges of the crack. Thin dust clung to the walls, drifting slightly as if stirred by a breath that did not belong to anyone in the room. Daniel forced himself to inhale deeply, guiding his mind to the shock that pressed against him like a rising tide. He had trained for disaster, for invasion, for cyber strikes, for every known scenario. But he had never been trained for whatever this was. The analysts began to whisper to one another, their voices uneven. Some stepped back. Others leaned forward in fearful curiosity. A few simply stared, their minds searching for logic that could no longer be found. General Roth raised a hand, signaling for quiet. The whispers died instantly. Daniel stepped forward again, each movement slow and controlled. He felt the weight of the room behind him, hundreds of eyes following his every shift. The air near the crack felt different, heavy, almost dense, as if the space beyond the wall leaked something unseen. Daniel extended his hand toward the fracture, not touching it, but close enough to sense the strange current that flowed from it. A subtle vibration traveled through the air, soft yet unmistakable. Roth watched him carefully. "What do you feel?" Daniel did not answer immediately. He focused on the sensation, letting the details rise. "It feels like pressure," he said finally. "Not physical pressure. Something else. Something pulling." Roth exhaled slowly, his expression darkening. "I do not like this." Daniel wanted to agree, but the words refused to come. He could not tear his attention away from the crack. Without warning, the lights flickered again. The red glow dimmed to a near darkness, then surged back with a deeper hue. Gasps echoed across the command hall. Daniel took another step back, expecting the wall to break open, expecting the unseen force to surge through. But nothing happened. Not a shift, not a tremor, not the smallest vibration. The stillness returned, thicker than before. A young analyst near the rear of the hall swallowed nervously and lifted his tablet. "I am getting a new data stream," he said. His voice trembled, but he forced the words out clearly. "It is feeding directly into our internal network." Roth's eyes snapped toward him. "From where?" The analyst shook his head. "It does not show an origin point." Daniel turned fully toward him. "What does the data contain?" The analyst looked down again, scrolling through the lines of incoming information. His eyebrows slowly pulled together. "It is not code. It is not coordinates. It is patterns. Repeating patterns." Daniel felt a familiar unease settle deep in his chest. "Show me." The analyst transmitted the data to the main display. Rows of symbols filled the screen, shaped in ways that resembled neither language nor mathematics. They twined together in fluid sequences that shifted every second. Daniel stared, captivated and disturbed. The patterns flowed like something that had rhythm, purpose, and a structure that felt almost alive. General Roth stepped closer to the screen. "It looks like a message." Daniel nodded slowly. "That is exactly what it wants to be." Roth glanced at him, troubled. "What do you mean by wants?" Daniel studied the display more closely. The symbols changed in precise intervals, like a pulse communicating through cycles. "It is not presenting information," he said. "It is waiting for something." A murmur spread through the room. The analyst closest to the main console spoke up, his voice unsteady. "I think it is responding to our system in real time." Daniel's heart hammered once. Heavy and deliberate, he stepped forward, gripping the edge of the display table. "If it is responding, then it is aware of us." The silence that followed swallowed every thought. Roth placed his hands behind his back, his posture rigid. "What does it want from us?" Daniel scanned the shifting symbols again. The patterns looped, changed, then repeated, each cycle carrying a slight difference. The differences were not random. They were testing something. He felt it in his bones. "It is learning," Daniel said quietly. "Whatever this is, it is studying us." The emergency lights flickered again. A low vibration passed beneath their feet, more subtle than before, but unmistakable. Daniel looked toward the buckled wall. The crack had not widened, yet the air around it felt charged, like the moment before a storm reveals its first flash of lightning. One of the officers near the entrance pointed with a shaking hand. "Look at the fracture." Daniel turned sharply. A thin thread of light seeped through the crack. Soft, pale, and unsettlingly calm. It did not glow. It breathed. The entire room went silent. Daniel took a step forward, then another. His heartbeat slowed, not in comfort, but in focus. Something inside him felt drawn toward that faint light, pulled by a force he could not explain. Roth reached toward him as if to stop him, but froze mid-motion. His eyes widened slightly, and Daniel realized the general felt it too. That unseen pull, that quiet summons. Daniel stopped 3 feet from the wall. The light flickered once, then again, then it slowly expanded, thin as a whisper, illuminating the fractured edges of concrete. A soft wind brushed across Daniel's face, though the air inside the room remained still. It carried no sound, no temperature, only presence. Daniel lifted his chin slightly, trying to understand, trying to listen, trying to decipher the sensation that touched the edge of his awareness. Behind him, the analyst watched in fearful silence. Roth held his posture, hands clenched at his sides. The light brightened. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Then, without warning, the light stopped, as if it had reached a decision. Daniel waited for the next movement, the next signal, the next shift that should have come. But nothing followed. The light remained frozen, locked in place, neither growing nor fading. The vibration stopped. The data on the screen froze mid-cycle. Everything halted. Roth stepped forward, confusion tightening his expression. What is it waiting for now? Daniel kept his eyes on the wall. He felt something pressing against the edge of understanding, something that hovered just beyond clarity. "It is not waiting," he said quietly. Roth blinked. "Then what is it doing?" Daniel felt the truth forming in his mind with slow, inevitable weight. "It is watching us." The room went cold. Daniel sensed it clearly. Not imagination, not fear. Something on the other side of that wall watched them with silent intent. Then, as the seconds stretched into an unbroken stillness, another realization followed. And Daniel knew it with absolute certainty. It was waiting for someone to move first. The single act that would decide what happened next. Daniel inhaled once, steady and deep. He moved his foot forward the smallest distance, barely an inch. Every eye in the command hall followed. The light inside the crack pulsed once. A pulse that did not repeat. A pulse that offered no meaning. A pulse that promised something imminent. Daniel held his breath, waiting for the response. But it did not come, and the silence continued, and continued, and continued, long enough for every person in the room to realize that anything could happen next. But nothing happened at all. The light inside the fractured wall remained perfectly still. It hovered there like a single held breath, suspended between two worlds that no longer understood one another. Daniel Hale stood only a few steps away, his shoulders tense, his mind sharpened to a point he had never reached in all his years of service. The room behind him was silent, filled with people who waited for him to decide what came next. He felt the weight of their fear. He felt the weight of his own uncertainty. Yet underneath it all, he felt something else growing slowly within him. Duty, clarity, resolve. Daniel took one final step forward. The moment he did, the light responded. It narrowed into a single line, thin and precise, as if it acknowledged his presence. Then it expanded again, not violently, not suddenly, but with a calmness that carried an impossible depth. The crack widened without sound. Concrete parted in a slow motion that looked more like a curtain being drawn than a structure being broken. No dust fell. No debris dropped. The wall simply opened. A narrow passage appeared beyond it. Roth took a step toward Daniel, his voice low but steady. "You do not need to go in." Daniel looked at him, and for the first time since the crisis began, he allowed a flicker of emotion to show in his eyes. "Someone must." Roth held his gaze for a moment, then gave a single nod, a nod that carried respect, fear, and acceptance all at once. Daniel turned toward the opening. A soft glow illuminated the hidden passage, revealing smooth surfaces that did not resemble anything built by human hands. The air inside carried no scent and no temperature. It felt empty, and yet full of something unspoken. Daniel paused at the threshold. He remembered the first alert that morning. The anomalies that no system could explain, the silence that had spread across the nation like a cold shadow. He remembered the tremors, the symbols, the presence behind the wall that felt aware of them. He thought of everything he still did not know, everything the country still feared, everything the world had yet to understand. He exhaled slowly, allowing the breath to steady his heart and quiet his thoughts. Then he stepped into the passage. The room behind him remained silent, but not from fear alone. It was a silence shaped by understanding. They all knew that whatever answer waited ahead, humanity needed it. Daniel took another step, then another. The light behind him dimmed, sealing the path he had come from. The walls shifted subtly, responding to his movement, not threatening, not aggressive, simply aware. At the far end of the passage, a faint shape materialized. It had no defined edges, no recognizable form, yet Daniel sensed intelligence in the way it held still. He sensed intention. He felt its presence settle around him like a quiet question. Daniel did not raise a weapon. He did not lift a hand in defense. He simply stood there, allowing the moment to unfold. The shape brightened slightly, and a soft ripple moved across the walls. The sensation washed through him, calm and strangely familiar, as if the force acknowledged him in return. Daniel felt the weight of fear fade from his body, not because he understood what stood before him, but because the presence did not carry hostility. It carried invitation. He lowered his shoulders. He lifted his chin, and he spoke with the full steadiness of a man who accepted his purpose. "I am here." The presence responded with a single pulse of light that filled the passage with gentle warmth. The Pentagon tremors stopped. The data streams went quiet. Every alarm across the building halted at the exact same second. The air grew still, peaceful, almost hopeful. Then the walls around Daniel shifted once more, closing him in a chamber of soft light that enveloped him completely. There was no fear in him now, only resolve. For the first time since the crisis began, the world was quiet. General Roth and the remaining officers waited outside the seal fracture, unsure what had transpired inside the light, unsure of what Daniel had found, unsure of what humanity had just witnessed. But they knew one truth with absolute certainty. The war no one saw coming had never been a war at all. It had been a meeting, a crossing of paths, a moment suspended between fear and understanding. And Daniel Hale had stepped forward to face it. The fracture seal behind him with a soft glow. Its light faded, its presence softened, and the building exhaled a long, quiet release. Outside, dawn began to rise across Washington. A new light touched the city as gently as a hand on the shoulder. The world remained uncertain. Questions waited without answers. But humanity had not fallen. It had been called, and it had answered, quietly, bravely, completely. The Pentagon stood silent as the sun lifted higher, casting warm gold over the city. A new day began, but the memory of that light, the passage in the wall, and the man who walked into it would never be forgotten.